Issue 22, also known as the proposal to sell Cincinnati's 143-year-old railroad, has been a source of spirited and, yes, sometimes even heated debate over the past few months. The Cincinnati Southern Railway, a 337-mile stretch of railroad that runs from Cincinnati to Chattanooga, Tennessee, is the country's only city-owned railroad. Cincinnati voters will decide on November 7th whether to approve the $1.6 billion sale of the railroad to Norfolk Southern or continue with the current lease agreement. I'm Kevin Aldridge. I'm the opinion and engagement editor here at the Cincinnati Enquirer, and I'm glad to be joined today by two of the Railway Board's trustees, former Cincinnati Mayor Charlie Luken and former Cincinnati City Councilwoman Amy Murray. Thank you all for joining me here today for this important community conversation.
Well, thanks for having us.
Thank you so much.
All right. So over the next few minutes, we're going to be discussing a variety of topics, including the makeup and composition of the board itself, and the process of how we got to where we are today, to where voters will be casting their ballots in just a few short days on the issue. So let's not waste any more time and let's get into to some of our questions. So I'll open this up to either one of you. Kind of tell me a little bit about the Railway Board, its construction, the roles of you as trustees on the board, because for many Cincinnatians, they're actually just in recent months have woken up to the idea that we even have a railroad that we own. So kind of talk about that.
You go ahead.
Kevin, first of all, thanks for having us. The board has been around since, I guess, 1890, and that's when the railroad was completed, and it was built by the city with the approval of the state legislature, and there was always a board, a 5-member board. Mm-hmm. And the board is 3 of one party and 2 of another, appointed by the mayor with the consent of city council. So it's a city board, but it's autonomous in the sense that the city council and the mayor do not have any direct authority over the board. Mm-hmm. The board actually does the negotiations and conversations with the lessee, which in this case is the Norfolk Southern Railroad, and I think has been the lessee in one form or another since about 1900 or around there. So the city doesn't really run a railroad. We don't have customers. We don't own rail cars. I don't even think we own the track. I think we own the dirt is what the city owns, and we lease it to Norfolk Southern. Is that?
Yes, and I think it's important to mention also that the Railway Board is not paid.
Okay.
So it's in the contract that we could get paid, but through the years, that has never been something that the board has ever looked at. So as I always say, we don't even get our parking paid for. So this is
we mentioned that because a lot of people say, what are you getting out of this? And, it's like, well, hopefully something better for the city, but nothing personally.
And I think that's what the board that we've all looked at, as Charlie mentioned, it's right now on the board 3 Democrats and 2 Republicans. And we all consider it, I do for my 8 years on council, the biggest thing that I have done for the city. It's so important. And I think we are all looking at what can we do to protect this asset for the city for the next 100+ years.
So you talked about the Railway Board largely handling the negotiations with Norfolk Southern. Kind of also talk about, do you guys have any responsibility over overseeing the maintenance of the railroads? And then just kind of also talk about the lease payments that come into you guys. Those lease payments don't go directly to the city, as I understand it. You guys are sort of the stewards over those dollars that come in. And how is it decided how those dollars get dispersed to the city?
So we really work hard to keep within our lane. We are the board and we are responsible for this asset. Mm-hmm. So the money comes to us from the leasing Norfolk Southern, and it's been about $25 million a year. And so we have things that we have to pay for from the board, whether it's legal counsel. Sometimes we'll have someone in Kentucky that needs part of a line changed or whatever. So we deal with that. And then we give the $25 million to the city, and they use it for infrastructure. So that's where we end. We are responsible for growing this asset, and then we give it to the city, and they use it for infrastructure purposes.
But to the first point of your question, Kevin, do we run the railroad? Do we have any oversight? The answer to that is no. I mean, a lot of people have asked about East Palestine because they see that tragic circumstance, and they wonder, what can our board do about it? And the answer is nothing, because it's interstate commerce. It is completely controlled by the federal government. And so people ask us, like, can you do anything to clean up the railway system? And the answer to that is no.
Okay. What would you say to those folks who say, because Mr. Luken, you made a point of saying you're appointed by the mayor, but they have no oversight or control over what you all do. What would you say to those folks who the cynics who would say, well, you guys are appointed by the mayor. You may say they don't have any direct authority over you, but how can residents trust that unelected appointed members are actually working for the community versus sort of being puppets or at the behest of the mayor and council?
Well, you've mentioned the word that I think is salient, and that is a trust, because I think this campaign is about trust and whether the public believes the messenger and the message. But all I can tell you is that until a couple of years ago, we never heard from the mayor or council or anybody else. In fact, most people didn't know the city owned a railroad. It was only a couple of years ago when this possible purchase came up. But because of the laws regarding boards like ours, we're really not permitted to engage in conversation with council members. And I mean, we can do it individually, but it's just something we have never done. And I have never, I shouldn't say I've never, I have never, before a couple of years ago, had conversations about this with anybody at City Hall, and nobody at City Hall has ever tried to influence me.
No. So the five of us that are on the board, none of us were initially appointed by this current mayor or council. So we all go back a ways. So it is 5 years. So it has some protections because we all initially come on by different mayors, and then you need to be re-upped after 5 years.
Okay.
But I think it's important to notice also, some people have asked us and they're confused about how do you have people that aren't elected making decisions on how the money is spent. And it's important to point out that we do not make that decision. We don't under the current system, and we would not under the new system. All we do is have the money and allocate it to council, and the elected people then are responsible for spending that money on infrastructure.
Great. So now I want to kind of rewind and take us back to sort of the beginning of this process and the negotiations with Norfolk, and even the idea of beginning to sell the railroad, because, the mayor kind of famously said when he was in front of our editorial board that nobody wants to be the one to sell the railroad, and that, this has kind of been something that's come up before in the past, but never really any serious considerations given to the notion of selling it. What changed? And how did that process begin for when we even began to consider this idea of selling our railroad?
Well, Kevin, when we first got into this, the lease comes up every 25 years, and the lease is starting to come up, and Norfolk Southern had to exercise an option to say we wanted that lease extended for 25 years. And they did that. And I think it's accurate, totally accurate, to say that this board had no intention of selling the railroad. They offered originally $800 or $900 million, then they went to $1 billion, then they went to $1.1 billion. Then they kind of came into town and tried to get some people to lean on us a little bit. But I know Amy particularly was strong about, we don't want to sell this. And I was, and Mark Mallory was, et cetera. But when the numbers got to where they are, the benefit to the city was undeniable. And I think that's where all of a sudden it went from 1.1 to 1.6. And frankly, I was shocked. And I was like, we have to ask the voters about this because the numbers are so large.
That's exactly right. And as Charlie said, I was not supportive when I was on council of selling the railroad. When we first came on, I thought there's no way that we can do this. We're responsible for this asset as we go further. But as we went into some of the negotiations and things that we learned about the railroad, I changed my mind. Now, the first thing that I was concerned about is if we sold the railroad, the money and everything would revert to the city. And I didn't trust that all the politicians, that it would just be spent like that. And so we had to have a law changed in Columbus with Governor DeWine and the legislature up there, so that if the railroad, if we're able to sell it, then the money, the finances stay within this board. It does not go to the city. And we allocate a certain amount to the city every year. So we wanted to make sure that that safeguard was there. The other thing that made me change my mind is as we were learning more about Norfolk Southern and the railroad business, and this was 2 years. So we had meetings quarterly, every one of our meetings were public. And as I think I've mentioned before, it's like, people never came to the meetings because it was a railroad board. But every meeting was noticed. Every meeting was public. Anyone could come to it. And as we were having these discussions and we were learning more about the business of the railroad, what really concerned me is Norfolk Southern has another route to get to Chattanooga. And I remember when they showed that up to us on the board, I didn't realize that. And Norfolk Southern, to go from $800 million to $1.6 billion, I thought if I'm that company, they must really want to own the rail line. And it seems like rail lines want to own the tracks that they're on. And Norfolk Southern does own most of the tracks they're on. So it makes perfectly good sense that they want to own this track. So as they make changes, they know that it's for the long term. But for me, when I realized that they had another option to get to Chattanooga, that really worried me because we have our $1.6 billion asset all with one company and in one industry. And I'll tell you, I don't know any private person that would want all of their money, all of their assets tied in with one company and one industry. So once all that came about, that really changed my mind.
So that raises the question as you talk about this and you talk about the negotiations, there might be some that would say, because the true real value of the railroad has been one that's been of question. And also this notion of, are there other suitors out there who would value it as much or perhaps even more than what Norfolk Southern is offering? So I'll ask a couple of questions directly. As they kept increasing the amounts that they were willing to pay, why the decision to stop at 1.6? Why not continue to press the negotiations and see if it was possible to get more?
Well, Kevin, we had pressed and pressed and pressed. I mean, we had rejected all their offers. We were adamant in our refusal. But when they got to 1.6, it was at the high end of what our experts told us it might be worth. So we have to look at it not in terms of what the railroad is worth, but what is the best way to get the maximum return cash for the people of Cincinnati. I mean, what the railroad is worth is important because it reflects what you can get for the citizens. We thought this offer was fair. And as I said, it doubled from where they were just a few months before. But I've heard people say, there might be more out there. Well, I don't know. I guess maybe we'll find out. But I can tell you that this is a pretty good deal. This is good money. This is more than doubling the amount of money the city will have for streets and bridges and parks and stuff. So we thought it was good. It was consistent with our experts, and we took it.
Yeah. And when you ask about what the other options were, if there are other rail lines, there weren't. I mean, rail lines have the lines that they use, and Norfolk Southern has the right of first refusal for this. So my concern is at some point, if Norfolk Southern says, we don't need this line, then it's going to be a fire sale, because if they don't use this line, then we are not only not receiving the $25 million a year, but we will then be responsible for the upkeep of the line from here to Chattanooga. And if another rail company by chance did want to use it, it would probably be undervalued because they know that we're trying to sell it. And so, as I said, when people bring up some of these ideas, we studied this for 2 or 3 years. We looked at every option because we were not selling it. And, we had 2 different types of experts in that shared all of this information with us. And so, people that say, oh, there's other, rails that are interested, that wasn't the case that we found.
Okay. When you talk about these experts that you have in, can you talk or quickly just kind of give us an idea of who these folks were, what areas they specialized in terms of looking at the issue?
We had 4, as I recall, and the valuations depended on whether you looked at it as a going concern, just the dirt. I mean, all these different ways to value it. But there is no exact apples to apples thing here, because when they talk about selling other rail lines, they're talking about selling customers. They're talking about selling cars and all kinds of things that we do not own. So there is no real apples to apples on this one. But these were people who are experts in the valuation of railroads across the country. And it depends how you look at it. As I say, the valuations went from 800 million. I think there was one that was 2 billion, but that was a weird outlier.
Yes.
Okay. As we talk about the lease also, it's been reported that Norfolk Southern had even at one point during these negotiations had offered to increase the amount to $37 million. And correct me if I'm wrong, if there's a different number that was out there, $37 million in the lease. What were the considerations there as far as you guys were concerned with the Railway Board? And then there's also been some conversations about could potentially more be negotiated in lease negotiations, at least that or maybe more.
Well, first I'll mention, that it's at $1.6 billion. We are going to receive, if it goes through, $1.6 billion. So at 5% interest, that's going to be $80 million a year. So we felt that was better for the city than $37 million a year, that we would be able to bring more money to the city. And second is, at that point, I think at least I was uncomfortable with having all of our assets with one company and one line. So I think at that point, I thought even if it's $37 million, if something happens down the road, then we might have nothing. So for me, that wasn't worth it.
I think that's one thing, Kevin, that's been understated in all this, and that is, what if? I mean, we don't know what the future's going to bring, but what if there are 10 more East Palestines and all of a sudden Norfolk Southern goes into bankruptcy court and our lease goes to zero? I mean, this is also about the diversification of our portfolio into the same way somebody might have a 401k or the same way a pension system might operate. So that was also, for me at least, a consideration that we have all our eggs in the Norfolk Southern basket. And as we've seen in East Palestine, that may not be the best choice.
Yeah.
Well, and if the same thing happened on our line, even though we'd be indemnified, we would still be sued as a city if that happened on our line. And so there's just a lot of risks that we have with having this asset.
Great. So let's shift gears here a little bit now and kind of talk about transparency. You brought this up that all of the meetings that you guys had were public, and I think if there's one thing I think that has the potential to sort of be a obstacle for this issue at the ballot box is people's perception of how transparent the process has been to this point. And I think it's important to say you guys are not affiliated at all with the campaign as the campaign for the issue that's currently going on. So you may or may not want to speak to how the campaign has handled that. But from your vantage point, some might look at it and say that once it got to the point, maybe they might even be able to understand a little bit. You don't want to negotiate with Norfolk Southern in the papers or in the public or on TV. That may not be wise negotiating strategy. But once it got to a point where the sale became apparent and things started moving towards getting the laws changed, could there and should there have been more that the Railway Board did to kind of raise the antenna of awareness to the public and say, hey, this is a big deal, and maybe even going so far as to the point of having some public hearings and things of that nature at this point?
So what really happens, though, how this is different than other issues is the public votes on this. Mm-hmm. On other issues, sometimes the public doesn't vote on it or on other things that the city's doing. So the public would have the ultimate say. So our responsibility was to get the best deal that we could to bring forward to the public. And as you said, this went through Columbus. This went through Governor DeWine's office. So everything was very open. Everyone in Columbus knew what was going on. Every one of our meetings were public and were noticed. When we were at the point where we felt comfortable with the deal, we had a press conference at Union Terminal and announced then what we were doing. So this has been going on for 10 months. Since that time, I know for Charlie and myself, we have been asked by many groups to come speak. Every group that has ever asked us to come speak on it, we went out to speak on it. So from our viewpoint, everything has been done in the open.
Yeah, and I this kind of raises the hair on the back of my neck a little, Kevin. Mm-hmm. So pardon me for a minute. These meetings were all noticed. If you look at our agenda, it says we're going to talk about the sale or lease of the railroad. If you look at our minutes, everyone says we talked about the sale or lease of the railroad. Nobody ever came, and that's fine. I think you have, as Amy said, this was announced in November. And there is nothing more transparent that I know of than an election. Now, should there have been more hearings earlier at City Hall? In hindsight, because of the way people have used these points to attack us, I guess so. But there's nothing about this that's not on our website. There's nothing about it that we aren't sharing with you now and haven't been sharing since at least November. And I would underscore what Amy said about the process in Columbus. I mean, the state legislature debated this in a very open way. The governor was involved. So, I don't get that criticism. I never have. I remember after the press conference that we had in November, waking up and looking at the newspaper and it said secret negotiations review come to deal or something. And I said, well, this must not be about us. I mean, literally, that's what I thought, because I was like, I don't get this. There is a process under state law for executive session for the discussions about personnel items and a sale, competitive sale or lease of public property.
And the other part is, I was really expecting after our November meeting where we announced this to the public that our next meeting, it would be jam-packed with people. So we had a bigger room. No one came. And so this was after we made this announcement. So that was surprising to me, because then, anyone could come and ask questions. And, a lot of the people, or a few of the people that are leading some of this charge, they've never come to any of the meetings. They've never asked any questions about why we are doing this or to try to understand it better.
But to your point, I mean, I guess if I look back now to November, I guess I would try to, our board is not set up for public hearings and things of that nature. Mm-hmm. We're just 5 volunteer appointees. But, I guess I would, given the way it's played out and the criticisms that you've articulated, I guess I would do it differently because I would seek to avoid those. But I think people have all of the information that they need to make an informed decision next week.
And I think part of it, though, is as the board, we are not the Issue 22 campaign. Mm-hmm. So we are not crafting how the campaign is run or anything like that. We're trying to stay focused on the job of, getting the best deal for this city. And if people are asking us, like here, explaining why we've made that decision.
You mentioned the conversations, the debate that went on with the State House around the issue and some of the guardrails that state legislators put in place to protect the principal and so forth and so on. And each of you have kind of intimated in our interview today about this issue of trust and even Ms. Murray, your original concern about how politicians might deal with that if the money went straight to the city. That continues to be one of the concerns that voters have expressed, that even with the guardrails that, hey, if you guys were able to go to Columbus and get state laws changed in order to do this, how can residents reasonably trust that future councils making a case for desperation for city funds for whatever might not go through the same process to be able to get some of those guardrails rescinded to be able to do what you feared in the first place? How are you addressing that question and concern?
Well, you're right, Kevin. I mean, in 20 years, could somebody go to the state legislature and get a law change and completely reconfigure this? I suppose. But I have never seen in my public life stricter guardrails on a pot of public money than has been put around this. And you've got guys who are not real liberal with the public money, like Senator Seitz and Senator Blessing and Mike DeWine, kind of architecting these guardrails. And I think the public can be assured that this will be how this money is spent now and in perpetuity. But if people want to go, they could, change it. The economy could tank. Norfolk Southern could go away. I mean, there are all kinds of what ifs in here. This is the most certain course for us.
Yeah. And I think one of the guardrails, too, is we have, a Democratic city council and mayor mainly, but we have a very, right now, Republican legislature and governor and things like that. So I think that automatically puts attention in the system as well, so that, we have both sides looking at this and saying this is a good deal. But, if our state stays similar in the future, I think it'd be harder for them to make changes. I think there'd be a lot of pushback. And I always look at, too, what's happened in the past is indicative of what might happen in the future. the city for 100 years has been very good about using the money for infrastructure. It's their responsibility, not ours. But from our end, we're just looking at right now, we give them $25 million for the infrastructure, but in the future, we'll be giving $50 million. So they'll be able to do hopefully twice as much work as needed. And that's what they've done in the past. So there's no reason to assume that they're going to change what they're doing.
Yeah, let's kind of go back to the lease for just a second. And in your guys' opinion, you guys have looked at, the lease and all iterations of the lease. How would you guys characterize how the lease is currently set up? And do you feel like the way the lease is currently set up, that it allows the railway board to operate from a position of strength in terms of negotiations?
I think it's unfair. I mean, I think it's unfair to us, the people of Cincinnati. It not only does Norfolk Southern have the right to renew it for 25 years, but we go to non-binding arbitration if we can't agree on a lease. If it goes to non-binding arbitration and the city rejects the arbitration, rejects the findings, we are able to sell it, go to try to sell it, which, as Amy described, is nearly impossible. But if we do sell it, Norfolk Southern has a right of first refusal. So who's going to bid on it when Norfolk Southern has a right to come in afterward? But I think where this is headed, Kevin, if this should fail next week, is it is headed to arbitration. Mm-hmm. And that process will unfold over the next several years, and we will fight as hard as we can to get as much money as we can.
Yeah.
But the arbitration, the lease was set up 25 years ago, and as Charlie said, it is not favorable to Cincinnati Southern Railway. It will put us in a very tough position.
Yeah. What do you think? And again, obviously trying to predict the future is somewhat of a fool's errand, but as you look at that, because that was going to be one of my questions a little bit down the road, but we'll address it now since this came up. So if this fails to voters on November 7th, is there a thought, plan, a process to bring this back? Or are we sort of locked into, now we're in negotiations for something for the next 25 years, and this is something that we would not entertain again until that point in time? So
I can only speak for myself, and my answer to that is we would not go back to the voters. First of all, we need the state law changed to allow us to go back to the voters. Will some future board ever go back to the voters? I don't know. But I think in the short term, at least for this board member, it's going to be a conversation about how much money can we get from this lease. Mm-hmm.
And the thing that worries me with that is this is something for the next 25 years. So we don't know what we would have in the lease. At one point, as you mentioned, $37 million was mentioned, but it will go back to the beginning point. Do I think it's going to be anywhere near 80 million, that we would get from the interest on the 1.6 billion? I don't think it'll be anywhere near that.
Well, but I think, Amy, that's what voters are going to expect. I mean, They have now offered $1.6 billion, and 5% interest is 80 million, 7% interest, 9% interest is 140 million, and that's kind of the experience of a lot of retirement systems. So the voters, the people of Cincinnati, are going to expect you to get that 80 million plus number. Mm-hmm. And the only way we're going to get that is through a real tough leasing process, which I think we've concluded is probably going to be difficult to get anywhere near that kind of number.
Okay. How long does that process typically play out, like an arbitration process? And is that something that we've ever had to go down? Is that a road we've had to go down before in our lease negotiations?
Interestingly, I'm getting older. I was the mayor the first time. Then last time this was negotiated with Mayor Ted Berry was the chairman of the board at that time. One of the board members is still the same, but that's irrelevant. Anyway, I think that we will be stuck with this process, and we will. Before they made a deal, 25 years ago, they made a deal. I think us making a deal, given what's happening right now, is going to be difficult. And there will be probably, I don't know, Amy, probably some new board members over the lease is up in 26. Mm-hmm. That's when it's up. So between now and 26, we will engage in this process. Will it be concluded by then? I don't know. I would bet not.
Okay. Dealing with the rail line takes a long time. I mean, that's why, as we said, we've been 2-3 years discussing just the lease. The lease started 2-3 years ago, the discussions about it. It's a long process.
So we've mentioned the projections of what we expect that we might be able to see realized from the $1.6 billion. And it's sort of been on the conservative end of $50 million a year to as much as, Mr. Luken, as you mentioned, $80 million a year. There have been some critics who have talked about fluctuations in the market and things of that nature, and how it is very hard to predict what you may get from year to year. And then there have also been conversations about how inflation might eat into some of those numbers that you all are projecting. Sort of talk about what you guys put into it, the experts again that you consulted, and the information that you guys got out of it that counters some of the criticism that folks are currently pitching at what the returns could be. And then also, if you can, in that, sort of talk about the impact of inflation, not just on the investment returns, but the impact on whatever lease amount that you guys might arrange with Norfolk Southern.
Well, and part of it goes to when we've been negotiating the railway sale, we've hired railway experts that can help us with this. So in this same area, we will hire financial experts, and we have a RFP that just finished, request for proposal for financial experts to manage this money. But one thing that we looked at, and I just have it here, is, if we look at other funds or trusts that have invested for the last 10 years, you can look at their returns. And here are just some, like the Ohio Public Employees Retirement System. Their 10 years has been 7%. State Teachers Retirement System, 9%. When we look at a lot of the nonprofits in the city, they're in the 7 to 9% area. So that's what we've been seeing through the long term as far as what returns are. We said, let's be conservative and go with 5%, but realistically it should be higher than that based on other funds that also deal with inflation and that also allocate funds out.
Yeah, and we are capped in the current lease at 4% for inflation. Our average increase based on inflation over the last decade has been 2%. So that's kind of what the lease goes up. Now, when we go into arbitration, I'm sure we'll argue to have the cap taken off for years like last year when it's crazy. But will we be successful? I don't know. But right now, we've been averaging about 2%. Obviously, the last couple of years, it's been higher than that, and it probably will go up 4% this year.
In terms of the manager of the fund, who's going to be overseeing that fund, how is that process going to play out? And is that going to be a process that the public is going to be able to engage in, that's going to be able to be publicly vetted, this individual? Because obviously this person is going to have a tremendous amount of responsibility over a very large sum of money for the city's investment. How is that process going to go about, and how are you all as a board going to engage the public in that?
Well, the names are out there now, and I read them in the Enquirer. That's the first I've seen them. We have hired a consultant. There's a consultant for everything, as you know. And this consultant is going to review the applications and with Amy's help and a subcommittee kind of try to whittle them down. But I can tell you that from my perspective, once we get them whittled down, I'd like there to be an open process about that too. I think equity and inclusion is a big piece of it that the community has every right to expect will be part of. Whoever gets it is going to invest the funds and have a track record in this area that is admirable. So I'd like to see some public input, a lot of public input before an actual selection is made. But Amy can probably talk about better because she's on the subcommittee.
Yeah. And so we haven't looked at any of the proposals or anything like that. As Charlie said, what the main thing we've done is we've gotten experts involved that deal with this on a day in and day out basis to help guide us as we look at these proposals and figure out which one would be the best one for the city. Also, the first proposal, it's time limited. So it's not like someone will have it for 15 years. It's 3 years. And so we'll be able to reevaluate and go forward as we need to.
Okay.
And I don't know. People keep asking me about the fee.
That will be in the proposals.
That's in the proposals. Yeah. I just haven't seen the proposals. My guess would be 0.25% a year, but I don't know.
Well, and that's what we'll look at the proposals, how they'll invest the money, what the fee will be, what they think the outcome will be. So we'll look at all of those.
Okay. As we've talked about what the range of returns could be on that, currently, from our current lease, we get $25 million. All of that goes to the city for infrastructure. We've talked about the possibility of anywhere from 50 to 80 million. I think it's been said that the city would get 50 million a year.
Yeah, because what would happen, Kevin, if we got 80, we'd take the 50 and give it to the city, 55 probably, and we'd throw the other money back in the principal.
Okay.
So we're keeping up with inflation over time.
Right. So that was going to be my question, is what happened to the sort of the difference between what you might actually realize and what you plan to disperse. And for those who may have the question, if the city were to come back and say on a particular year, maybe we need a little bit of extra money this year for infrastructure, is it capped at the 55 million, or will the city have the latitude to come back if there is 80 million in a year and say, hey, maybe we want the whole 80 million? Is that, and would the railway board do that?
What we're going to look at is what the investments have brought in during that year, and then look at what we need to put back in to keep up with inflation and what we would give to the city. So we don't look at it based on what does the city need this year. That's kind of that wall that's up. We are looking at it from how do we grow this asset so that we can continue to give money to the city.
Well, yeah, but to your point, Kevin, I won't be on the board when this happens, but let's say you get a year when it's 10, 15%, and all of a sudden you didn't get 80 million, you got 150. I would think the board might go, if there's a particular need, hey, as long as we're protecting and growing the principal, there may be some years, and I hope there will be,
absolutely,
when we go over this number. So I don't want you to think that it's just going to be 50 every year and 55 every year and the rest goes back. That is not, the board will make a decision based on all these factors every year.
Oh, absolutely. So we're hoping that if we make more money in investments that year, we'll give more to the city.
Sure. And so obviously with that, comes in, and I realize this is not necessarily the purview of the railway board in terms of determining how money is spent, but you could see the thought process of someone who's concerned about city fiscal responsibility and how they might use money, about how if you have a big year like that where the city gets $150 million and there is more coming into the city, how that money might be spent and what it might be spent on. And I think how comfortable, again, realizing this is not your purview, but being concerned about protecting the assets that you have for the city, that there's not wiggle room in terms of the way that we talk about existing infrastructure and things, because people are always concerned about the pet projects, the haves getting more than the have-nots out of this money versus, the roads in my neighborhood or my street have been terrible for years, but this money is going instead to improvements to, build some new arena or something like that.
The main thing to remember is the money that we give to the city, whether it's from a lease or from a sale, they spend it regardless. So, this could be the case under either scenario.
Sure. And I think that I think there's a question here. There's always going to be elected leadership. And I may not agree with the way they spend every dime or even most of their dimes, but that's not for me to decide. That's for the public electing their leadership to decide. And if they don't like the way they spend it, or they don't like the neighborhoods that they spend it on, then that's a subject for public discourse around an election. That's not going to be something that the board is going to get into. But I think, and I'm just anticipating in my own mind, I can foresee circumstances where there would be tension between the board and the city. How much money should we get this year? And that's why the board, I think, is the one that's going to say, no, we have to, by law, protect the fund. So, but I could see, you get a couple good years, I could see the mayor going, hey, how about a little something, And I think there could be some tension there.
How and we're entering in our last couple of questions here. What do you think about the process for selecting folks who are sitting in your seats now? Like right now, we talked about how those are unelected positions that are appointed as by the mayor. Mr. Luken, being a former mayor yourself, I'm particularly interested in how you might answer this question. Given the stakes, given what we've learned about, the board and in particular the selling of this asset, do you think that there might be a reason to look at how this board is constructed and configured and put together, or do you think this changes nothing?
Well, I'm smiling because when I was a mayor and nobody was paying attention, I used to struggle to get people who wanted to serve. But I think there'll be a lot more interest in serving going forward. So I think it would be healthy to look at the method of selection and who's on it and how they get picked. I mean, right now you've got 2 Republicans, 3 Democrats. There's probably a board member that turns over every year. So, but I guess this early, I'm kind of like, well, the mayor appoints, the council approves. That seems like the way we do boards in this city. And if people have better ideas, I think after this election be a good time to talk about them.
I think part of what might happen too is in the past, you're looking for certain qualities for board members, or you were looking just for a board member that was willing to serve. But I think in the future, you'd have people probably, I would assume that because this would now, if it sells, be a trust. So you'd probably be looking for people that have more money management experience.
Yeah. I mean, people have said we're political people, and Amy and I have a background in running for office, and so does Mark Mallory. The other 2 people are pretty apolitical, but I do think Amy's point's well taken, and that in the future you might look for people with a different skill set should this pass. I mean, I don't know what I bring to the table. There is a relationship with City Hall. Some understanding of the community would be important. Some understanding of the political process would be important, but maybe not as emphasized as it is today.
Great. Last question for you guys. Tell Cincinnati voters why this is something worth voting for on November 7th, why it's better than what we currently have.
Well, I'll be brief. Cash. Really, I think the voters should not think about running a railroad, what it means. I think it's cool that we own a railroad. I don't think it's $50 million a year cool. But I think voters should take a hard look at what's going to provide the most money for the streets and bridges and parks and rec centers in the city. And that, to me, is what should determine the vote.
And my main concern as I talk to people that ask me about this is, we mentioned before, right now we have our $1.6 billion asset with one company and in one industry. And if anything changes in those, we could lose a lot as a city. So if I was investing my own money and I treat this like my own, I would not want to be tied with one company and one industry for our future.
How much did you guys look into Norfolk Southern as you guys were thinking about this in terms of the outlook on where they're going? I mean, as you said, if they have 10 more East Palestines, they could. I think there are a lot of people who are questioning sort of where they are even now in the midst of.
They're the partner we're tied to because of the lease and because of all that they have right of first refusal for so many things. They're our partner, and they've been our partner for the last 100 years. So
they're one of the biggest railroads in the country. They're successful. I didn't mean to imply they're going out of business next year, but our rail line, it's important to note, we're 377 miles, and on both ends we're bracketed by Norfolk Southern track. So people say somebody's going to come in and operate this thing, and it's all regulated by the Surface Transportation Board out of D.C. So it's more complicated than I know, to be honest with you. But what do I know about Norfolk Southern? I know they're a big, successful railroad company. That's pretty much what I know about them.
Yeah. Well, listen, thank you all for taking time out to join me here today and for providing what hopefully will be some helpful information for voters as they go to the polls to make the decision that they feel is best for the city of Cincinnati.
You're nice to have us.
Thanks.
Thank you so much.
All right. Take care.